Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching the Africa Brief on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top stories coming out of the region this hour. Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan secures over 95% of the vote in a landslide election victory. This has come from the state TV amid ongoing internet blackout. The result comes after days of deadly protests, with the opposition claiming hundreds killed and the UN reporting credible evidence of at least 10 deaths. President Donald Trump designates Nigeria as a country of particular concern over religious freedom violations, opening the door to possible sanctions. Trump claims Christians face an existential threat, while Nigeria denies the allegations, saying most attacks by armed groups target Muslims in the north. More than 60,000 people have fled al-Fashur in Darfur after its capture by the Rapid Support Forces militia, the UN has said. The mass exodus comes amid reports of executions, abductions and ethnic targeting as fighting intensifies in Sudan's west. Witnesses say hundreds of men were shot or disappeared after al-Fashur fell, and the rise of the RSF paramilitary, with civilians describing summary executions. Aid groups warn of possible war crimes and urge an independent international investigation into the killings. A Tunisian court sentences a prominent critic of President Kais Saied to 5 years in prison as authorities suspend an independent media network. Rights groups say the actions mark a deepening crackdown on dissent and press freedom in the country. Cameroon's opposition leader calls for a nationwide ghost town protest that is already being observed in the northern city of Mora. Businesses and markets remain closed as fears of a harsh government response grow amid political tensions. Israeli media reports that body parts handed over by the Red Cross do not belong to any of the missing hostages after forensic examinations were completed. The transfer had followed Israel's return of 30 Palestinian bodies to Gaza, a move seen as part of efforts to sustain the fragile ceasefire despite recent deadly strikes. Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting South Korean President Lee Jae-myung on the final day of the APEC summit, his first visit to South Korea in over a decade. Tanzania's Electoral Commission has declared President Samia Suluhu Hassan the winner of Wednesday's general election with nearly 98% of the vote, a result that has triggered deadly protests across the country. The poll, which has taken place amid the exclusion of major opposition candidates, has been widely criticised as unfair. The main opposition party, Chadema, claims around 700 people have been killed in 3 days of unrest, while the United Nations reports at least 10 deaths in Dar es Salaam, Srinagar and Morogoro. Security forces have been accused of using live ammunition and tear gas against demonstrators, while authorities have imposed a nationwide curfew and restricted internet access. The government has dismissed the higher casualty figures as exaggerated, saying violence was limited to isolated incidents. And the United Nations has called for an impartial investigation into allegations of excessive force. Hassan, who first took power in 2021 after the death of John Magufuli, will now serve a 5-year term over the East African nation of 68 million people. Okay, we're now joined by Professor Kilboga Mamfonye. He is an African politics and elections expert, and he joins us live from Pretoria in South Africa. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme, Professor. Now, Professor, President Hassan's landslide comes with reports of violent crackdowns and more than 700 deaths from, of course, the opposition party within Tanzania. The United Nations say there's credible evidence of 10 deaths. How credible is the victory of Hassan's win, given the scale of unrest and alleged intimidation?
Well, given the scale of the unrest and the intimidation, or one should say the pre-election tensions in the country in the run-up to last Wednesday's poll, as well as the outcome now, the credibility of the outcome will obviously be shrouded in uncertainty, in a sense that you don't want to have an election that is marred by violence. And not just violence, but deaths. You know, once we hear that there's a death, or one death is one death too many for an election. And in Africa, we've seen this script over and over and over again, whereby governments, possibly, intending to stay in power for as long as possible. I'm not saying this is the case right now with Tanzania, because we still have to look at, what are the causes of the violence. But in other countries, for instance, we have seen the script in Mozambique. We have seen the script in countries such as Nigeria, Cameroon right now, as your reports were indicating, they are running protests there, election-related protests. So in this case, the credibility of the election will definitely be under question, partly because of the allegations of excessive force, as your reporters are stating, and also the United Nations is also saying there should be investigation. And such excessive force, we have also seen it in previous elections in countries like Zimbabwe. At the end of the day, it will be difficult for the African continent not to obviously accept the President Suluhu's victory as a victory, given that I take it that the Independent National Electoral Commission has got the data which can be verifiable, to show that he has indeed won, according to their reports, and of course, ending in declaring her the winner. But of course, if you have an election that is happening while major opposition party candidates are either arrested or detained or beaten up, others are running away, they are helter-skelter, and there are reported deaths of people, being intimidated. At the end of the day, such an election, the credibility of such an election becomes questionable, as I keep saying.
And Professor Maffonye, what do you have to say about just the sheer landslide that she obtained, supposedly 98% of the vote? Tanzania was once seen as one of Africa's more stable democracies. Does this mark a slide for Tanzania back into authoritarianism?
Over 90, the report says she won a landslide of over 97.7%, if I've got the figure correct. But for me, yes, indeed, if you win an election by that margin, it is indeed supposed to be called a landslide. However, if you win an election with those kinds of figures and allegations of intimidation of opposition figures, including members of the main opposition Chadema party and the others, a crackdown on the media. I understand the internet at one point was shut down. I wasn't observing elections in 2016 in Uganda, where I experienced this kind of situation, whereby just when reports were coming out that apparently the Museveni, party, the NRM, was going to lose, or about to lose, then the internet was shut down. The following day, when the internet was back again, then of course he was announced the winner. Now, in such situations, I don't know whether in the case of Tanzania, this will indicate that the country is now veering into that direction. But clearly, it does not augur well for electoral democracy in the continent. It also does not augur well for free and fair elections. I would be very, very carefully going through the election observer reports, some of which are already very critical about the freeness as well as the fairness of the poll. And in such a situation, obviously, this will affect the legitimacy of the election outcome.
Yes, Professor Maffonye, do stay with us as you're discussing further stories from the region here on NewsX World. We now move on, and according to the UN Refugee Agency, more than 60,000 people have fled the Sudanese city of El Fasher after it was captured by the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces over the weekend. Survivors report atrocities including mass executions, sexual assault and widespread starvation. Many are fleeing towards Tawila, around 80 kilometers west, with children suffering from severe malnutrition. An estimated 150,000 people remain trapped in El Fasher, the army's last stronghold in western Darfur. The RSF has denied ethnic targeting but detained a militiaman accused of killing unarmed men. Sudan's civil war, which began in April of 2023 between the army and the RSF, has caused a famine and claims of genocide. More than 150,000 people have died and around 12 million have been displaced in the world's largest humanitarian crisis. The takeover of El Fasher leaves the RSF in control of Western Sudan, while the army holds Khartoum and eastern regions, deepening the country's divide. Professor, we have some more information coming out of that region. And witnesses have described scenes of the targeted killings by the RSF after the capture of Sudan's El Fasher. The UN Human Rights Office earlier said that hundreds of civilians and unarmed fighters may have been executed in Al Fasher, calling such acts war crimes. The RSF has denied the allegations, saying they were fabricated by opponents seeking to obscure their defeat. According to Doctors Without Borders, eyewitnesses have reported that about 500 civilians and Sudanese army soldiers tried to flee Al Fasher on October the 26th, but most were killed or captured by the RSF and allied forces. Let's in fact listen in to some of the eyewitnesses who fled the city of Al Fasher.
مشيت على الفاشر وماشيين في الشارع. بعد ما مشينا وصلنا لقينا البلد سقط. بعد ما لقينا البلد سقط جدانا البداء والناس اللي قبضوهم ببداء صفهم تقريبا 8 نفر دايل صفهم معي جنبي، ومن هناك دارونا بجمال جابونا على خزان.
ظهروا لنا فجأة ناس دل من وين؟ الله أعلم. ظهروا لنا 3 شباب أعمار متفاوتة، ضربوا نار هوائي، أجيفوا لابسين لبس بتاع الدعم السريع.
Professor Mafounye joins us once again to discuss this. Of course, devastating scenes coming out of Sudan once again. The United Nations has said tens of thousands have fled El Fasher after its capture by the Rapid Support Forces just a few days ago. What does this tell us about the humanitarian collapse of Darfur right now?
It tells us that the situation is very drastic, very dramatic, and highly unacceptable for political stability and peace in the region and also in the Sudan itself. And it also tells us that the African Union, including the relevant regional bodies that should be maintaining peace in the sub-region, should actually be taking very serious emergency measures to counteract the situation. What has been happening in the Sudan is obviously an unacceptable situation in the sense that it creates a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable proportions. And to that extent, it does not augur well, for economic stability, for trade relations, and of course political stability. Therefore, it means at the end of the day, the situation in the Sudan, as mentioned even by the United Nations, Secretary General, demands immediate action, and it means all the forces that are relevant in this case, not only just the African Union, but also including the United Nations and other forces, relevant bodies, should come together and come up with an immediate intervention and solutions for the country.
Yes, Professor Mafounye, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. It's a pleasure to get your insight. We now move on, and President Donald Trump has opened the door for sanctions to be imposed on Nigeria for allegedly failing to rein in the persecution of Christians in the West African country. President Trump announces that he would designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern as it relates to religious freedom, a move that had been pushed by some US lawmakers. Meanwhile, the Nigerian government vehemently rejects the claims, whereas reports suggest that while Christians are among those targeted, the majority of victims of the armed groups are Muslims in Nigeria's Muslim-majority north, where most attacks occur. Okay, we are now joined by Ambassador Mahesh Sachdev, former Indian ambassador. He joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much for joining us, Ambassador Sachdev. How significant is this? Of course, Donald Trump certain states likes to make claims. How credible is this statement that Christians are being persecuted in the West African country of Nigeria?
To quote from his book, The Art of the Deal, Trump's statement is a truthful hyperbole. There's some element of truth, but much of it is hyperbolic. Nigeria is Africa's largest country by population, and the population is almost equally divided between Muslims and Christians. The issues that should be focused on, irrespective of religion, is the Boko Haram insurgency, as well as the unrest between settlers and nomadic people. On both these accounts, Christians have come to be persecuted, if I can use that word, by the anti-government forces. Boko Haram is a Muslim fundamentalist organization, and it wishes to establish Islamic rule over Nigeria, which is a unrealizable concept. It is confined to northeast of the country, where few Christians live, but whenever it can, it does harm them. But the numbers are not large because that is not a Christian area. In the central Nigeria, there are other groups of nomadic tribals, cowherders, etc., who periodically move in search of pastoral land. And they come in conflict with the settled farmers, many of whom are Christians. Nomadic pastoralists are mostly Muslims of Fulani stock. So between them, whenever clashes take place, Christians are a majority of the people that are hurt because they are the settlers. And on both these accounts, from Boko Haram and from Fulani settlers, the Christians have been disproportionately harmed as compared to Muslims. Muslims are also hurt and devastated, but the numbers are a bit less. Now, let us make it absolutely clear that these clashes happen despite the government and not due to the government. So Mr. Trump using the word genocide or Christians being persecuted, etc., does not stand the ground.
Yeah.
These are terrorist incidents, and Christians happen to be slightly more affected than the Muslims.
Yes, Ambassador Sachdev, thank you very much, as always, for bringing your insight on that. Do stay with us as we have some further updates from the African continent coming straight to our viewers. A Tunisian court has sentenced a prominent critic of President Kais Saied to 5 years in prison. This arrest is the latest in a series of actions targeting opposition figures who accuse Saied of using the judiciary to cement what they say is his authoritarian rule. Ahmed Souab, a former administrative judge who was convicted by an anti-terrorism court in Tunisia, was detained in April over comments criticising the judiciary. Meanwhile, Tunisian authorities have also ordered the suspension of the Nawat journalists group, which runs one of the country's leading independent investigative media outlets. The 1-month suspension follows similar actions against prominent civil society groups. At least a dozen Tunisian political activists have been imprisoned. Several NGOs have reported frozen bank accounts, and at least 5 journalists have been jailed under President Saied's rule. Saied rejects the criticism about oppressing independent media and civil society groups, insisting that freedoms are protected and that he will not become a dictator. Now we move to our final story, and the United Nations Security Council has adopted a US drafted resolution calling for renewed negotiations on Western Sahara based on Morocco's autonomy plan, describing it as the most feasible solution to the territory's decades-long conflict. The resolution has urged Morocco and the Algeria-backed Polisario Front to engage in serious discussions in the coming weeks. 11 members have voted in favour, while Russia, China and Pakistan abstained. Algeria declined to participate, saying the text fails to uphold decolonisation principles and ignores the Polisario Front's demands. The resolution also extends the mandate of the UN mission, MINUSURO, for another year and requests a strategic review within 6 months. Morocco's plan would grant Western Sahara autonomous legislative and judicial powers under Rabat's sovereignty, while Polisario Front continues to demand a referendum on independence, an option excluded from the current proposal. Ambassador Sachdev joins us once again. The UN Security Council has adopted this US drafted resolution backing Morocco's autonomy plan as the most feasible path forward in this near 50-year-long conflict. Do you see this as genuine progress towards peace?
Genuine or not, it's a breakthrough, all right. For 50 years since Spanish withdrawal from Western Sahara, the colony held by Madrid, in 1975, the issue has hung fire between Morocco, that shortly after Spanish withdrawal occupied that territory, and the Polisario Front, backed by Algeria, that has been waging a guerrilla struggle against Spanish occupation. The fighting between Moroccan forces and Polisario halted later by the United Nations intervention, but the solution has defied the international community, and the issue remained on the boil, despite a long winding ceasefire. What Morocco wants is to be recognized as the sovereign country whose part is Western Sahara, while Polisario Front wants it to be subject to a referendum as a decolonization issue. So after dithering for nearly 50 years, the UN Security Council has finally passed a resolution that is tilted towards Morocco's autonomy solution, which was offered initially in 2007. It does not talk about a referendum, but it does allow a great deal of autonomy to the territory with the defense, foreign affairs, and religious affairs being controlled by Rabat. This obviously does not please Polisario and Algeria. But I should also add here that Pakistan, a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, has had to walk a very tight rope because it talks about Kashmir dispute and demands referendum there, while it has gone into an abstention on the issue of US piloted draft resolution, which denies Polisario the same referendum demand. So it has had to abstain and talk about unbalanced nature of the resolution.
Yes, Ambassador Sach.
It's a bit inelegant posturing. Thank you.
Ambassador Sachdev, thank you as always for bringing your insight on the African continent. It's a pleasure to have you here on the programme. Thank you, and that is all that we have time for here on the Africa Brief. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world. Thank you.